I'm delighted to see you all this morning. The intersection of young adults and teenagers, faith formation, and technology are never what they seem. This may seem like what my students call a PGO, penetrating glimpse of the obvious. It's actually not a penetrating glimpse of the obvious. I think it's a fairly profound truth. This came home to me a few years ago when I was celebrating Mass at St. Peter's in North Cambridge, and when you have the Mass, you have the phone duty. So 15 minutes before Mass, the phone rang and I picked it up and said, St. Peter's Parish, can I help you? And the voice said, could you tell me who has the 5 o'clock Mass today? And I said, I can, Father Mark Massa. And they said, there was a pause, and then she said, is that the short, plump, balding priest? And after the shock of recognition had passed, I said, yes, it is, as a matter of fact. That is why I'm especially delighted to introduce Theresa O'Keefe to you this morning, who's one of our stars across the street at the STM. Theresa has served in the Department of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry since 2005, and she is currently an associate professor of youth and young adult faith and coordinator of our quite fine contextual education component, which is a required practical component for 2 of our 3 big master's degrees. She is a native of Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and comes from a large and extended family of 9 children. Let me say that again, okay? She comes from a family of 9 children where her sainted mother raised you all as believing Catholics. So, Theresa's academic interests are directly motivated by her experience in faith formation at the local level. Prior to coming to Boston College in 2000, she worked for 10 years in the Office of Religious Education for the Roman Catholic Diocese of Springfield, Massachusetts. There she served as a consultant to parishes in faith formation, assisting parishes as they attended to children, youth, and young adults in their care. In this work, she was challenged to consider the diversity of concerns that each parish had to face. At the STM, Theresa teaches courses entitled Identity from Discovery to Integration, the Practice of Ministry with Youth and Young Adults, as well as Education for Faith and Justice. It is her goal to assist ministerial and educational leaders to read the context of contemporary culture and to analyze its impact on youth and young adult populations as they prepare to serve. Please join me in welcoming one of our stars, Dr. Theresa O'Keefe.
I'm a star. Woo! I'm going to remember that for at least the rest of the day. So, good to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, to share with you some reflections I have on research on teens and the use of technology, or maybe I should more broadly say human beings, some of whom are teens, and the use of technology. And when I say teens, it kind of fit nicely, teens and technology, but really I'm talking about a broader spectrum from early teens into young adulthood. Okay? As a pastoral theologian, the work that I do isn't necessarily direct empirical research, but I spend a lot of time analyzing other people's direct empirical research and trying to make sense of it theologically and also ministerially. So that's what I'm inviting you to join on with me today in an effort of looking at research around the use of technology, particularly by teens, and what impact it has for the work that we do with them, and what impact it has in our own lives. But first I want to get a sense of who's in the room with me. So I'm looking for a show of hands. Anybody here who was born before 1970? Okay. We all pretty much safely got to our 20s without having technology as part of our life, and the kind of technology most of us think of today. How many in the room are parents of adolescents? Okay. Grandparents of adolescents? Okay. How many in the room are ministers or educators responsible for adolescents or young adults? All right, thank you. How many of you are young adults yourselves? Nice. Ooh. I really am a star. Oh my gosh. Okay. And are there any in the room who would be adolescents? It's like, teenagers. No. All right, good, we can talk about them. All right. Teens today, anybody born around the turn of the millennia, have grown up with this technology around them constantly. And that change in social atmosphere is going to mean a lot for their changing engagement with the world. I suggest to you, adolescents are the same as they have always been. The world in which they live is different enough from the worlds that I grew up in and many of you did. All right, so let's go. Kenneth Gergen, in his 1991 book, The Saturated Self, reflected on the contemporary challenge of living in a world of new communication and travel technologies. He argued that these technologies made demands on the human person and on their sense of themselves, pulling them in diverse and multiple directions. We could fly to Hong Kong from Boston in a day and answer emails and receive faxes and phone calls from Texas and London. His assessment is that we were resigned to lives of multiphrenia, by which he meant that we can't have an integrated sense of self or a single identity because we were pulled in so many different directions by diverse groups. I used to use this text in a syllabus of a course, and I took it off a couple of years ago because the students found his 1991 references to technology too humorous and too antiquated, as you do, that it became a distraction. But more importantly, as I listened to them, they did not experience technology to be as problematic as he did. They did not bemoan the social saturation that digital communication invited. Rather, they found the technological atmosphere that Gergen bemoaned essential for their lives. It was by which they connected to people and ideas. It provided the ability to traverse time and space so as to communicate with anyone, anywhere. They would ask me, what's his problem? It's not all doom and gloom. He doesn't get it. They concluded Gergen's view reflected an unprofitable generational divide. That apparent difference of perspective had me asking, what is at issue? What is the impact of digital technology on our lives and on the lives of young people? Is it simply a question of, is it good or is it bad? Should it change how we minister to adolescents and young adults who perceive digital technology as an essential element of their atmosphere? Or do we just need to get with the times? Is the difference in our attitudes simply generational? Is there a distinction between those who came to maturity before much of this digital technology was available and those who have grown up in the midst of it? Is it simply that those familiar with the technology are less anxious about its role in their lives? Or is it that those who are not digital natives feel some sense of loss amidst our shift to greater dependence on technology? Regardless, if we are honest, for both young and old, digitally mediated communication is part of our world and our lives. More and more of our activities of daily life take place in digitally mediated spaces. More and more of the activities of daily living take place online or through our phones. The most helpful questions might be the ones about how we engage with technology, how we engage with one another. Technology, by changing the media of communication, changes the manner and the substance of our interactions with each other. And this is what we'll investigate today. So perhaps there are more helpful questions. How is technology good? How is it limited? What does it promise? But what does it actually deliver? Today's plan, I always find it helpful to know when someone's going to end. So I'm giving you my outline for today. All right. It's in 4 main parts, and we'll do the first 2 parts, then we'll take a break, and then we'll do the second 2 parts. Okay? So first we'll look at what's at issue. I take this from a theological stance, asserting that humans are made in and for relationships. And then when it comes to teens and relationships, technology has actually long played a role in building and deepening relationships. Then we will investigate the current research and what it has to say about our use of technology, particularly its role in our relationships. And finally, we'll suggest some rethinking of our practices with technology. So 4 parts, and we'll do parts 1 and 2, and within that there'll be moments of a chance for you to talk with one another, and maybe I'll draw some things out from the larger group. Then we'll take a break between 2 and 3, and then go on to the end. So there's the plan. So what's at issue? This is a theological starting point. We are made for relationships. That's what we claim as Christian persons, that God has made us for relationships. Before our deciding, we are born into relationships with our family, with God. We don't decide about them, they're already there. But as time goes on, we intentionally develop more relationships with friends, with family, romantic connections, all sorts of relationships. They are both the most rewarding aspects of our lives, but also the most difficult. They're rewarding in that our close relationships are places where we feel seen, known, and valued for who we really are. They're difficult because good relationships take constant effort of reaching out, trusting, listening, caring, forgiving, and accepting one another. It takes going beyond myself to really know another and to let them really know me. Relationships take the constant work of love appropriate to each relationship: family, friend, work, romantic partner, neighbor, stranger, all of them. And God's highest hope for us is that we enter into our relationships well, that we enter into them with love, and see that love is the most important thing that we do. Not something that we do if we have free time or when everything else gets settled, but this is the first thing, the most important thing. And Jesus responded, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." The whole of the law and the prophets depend on these 2 commandments. The amazing thing about adolescence, for all of us, is that it was the first time in our lives that we're able to recognize relationships as such. Even though we had been embedded in them since our birth, as children, we tended to see relationships more instrumentally. Parents are there to provide for me, and friends were for playing with. It's not until we're adolescents that we gain the cognitive capacity for self-consciousness, whereby we begin to see more in ourselves. We begin to develop a sense of our inner lives with ideas, hopes, and interests unique to us. We begin to see ourselves as unique persons. I am someone. Has anybody else noticed? Now, in time, and I underline, with prodding, we begin to see others as full persons too. Friends are no longer just playmates or the kids with cool toys, but are chosen for similar interests and outlooks. Parents are no longer simply the provider of groceries, but people in their own right with cares, concerns, hopes, and dreams. So adolescence becomes a very important time in our lives for learning how to relate. We begin to learn our sense of consequence in the lives of others. We begin to learn reciprocity. We begin to learn to take responsibility for ourselves and for others. Adolescence is when we begin to see the world relationally rather than instrumentally, and it is a capacity, once begun, we continue to develop throughout our lives. Our capacity to learn relationships begins in our early teens, but progresses and deepens throughout our 20s and beyond. Coming to see the world relationally, though, takes learning and practice. It is far from automatic. An ability to relate well, though, is expected as an adolescent moves into adulthood. It's expected on the job, it's expected of friends and colleagues, it's expected of roommates and professors, and it's expected of romantic interests. Our hope for adolescents that are dear to us is that they thrive in these relationships with romantic others, with friends, with colleagues at work. But too often we don't pay attention to what it takes to learn good relational skills, or we assume it comes automatically, and I would argue it doesn't. It doesn't. How do we learn to relate well? I believe our relationships teach us how to be in relationship. Learning how to relate well is discovered in and motivated by good relationships. Good, robust relationships that grow and deepen over time allow for us to learn how to trust, to be vulnerable, to accept and take risks, to forgive and care. Good relationships have the capacity to provide the motivation to grow the skills of relating well. Good relationships with real people call us to become our best selves. On the other hand, the absence of such relationships means those skills may not be learned. I invite you now to take a moment for yourself in silence. How do you know this to be true? What does it mean for you to be seen, known, and valued for who you really are? When did you first learn to invest in relationships? Where did you learn? Which relationships taught you how to relate? Now, you're probably all wondering, when was she ever going to talk about technology? Been here half an hour and she hasn't said much about it. In some ways, I want to suggest that teens and technology and relationships have been connected for a long time. And in some ways, it's kind of the same old, but it's different too. If you were born during or after the 20th century, some technology has always been part of your relating. It's just a matter of which one. Okay, so by a raising of hands, I want to know, for how many people was this technology an important part of your relationships? Okay, and probably many of you have stories about the family phone. As Mark said, I'm one of 9 children. And there was 2 interesting things. My brothers were more likely to spend time on the phone than the girls in the family. And secondly, my father had a rule. He'd see you on the phone, he'd walk by you and say, "Who are you talking to?" And if I said Michelle, he'd say, "It'd be faster for you to go to her house. Go. Get off the phone." So it was a rule that said that technology in my house was only a means to organize a face-to-face meeting. Okay. How many people had the family car as their means of technology to relate with their friends? Oh. And how many eventually had their own car to help those relationships? Right? If these are yours, and I expect there are for many of us, we had to make decisions around their use, or our parents made those decisions for us. And parents' concerns circled around their son or daughter's safety, their responsibilities to others, their obligations to school or to work or to the family. But for teens using those technologies, they're principally a means of growing relationships with friends, with work, or with school. Now a different technology is being used to do the same thing. Raise your hand if this has been yours. Come on, look at their like little hands, like, can you raise them? Be proud. Okay. Technology promises to connect us and to enhance our relationship. That's one of its big promises. If you watch ads, if you look at all the stuff, one of the big promises that it makes is that it will enhance our relationships. And since 9/11, parents have linked technology also with hopes of security and safety. So it's not a simple question of do we use technology or not use technology? Rather, we have to ask, what does it promise and what does it deliver? Okay. So let me turn to something I said earlier. Technology, by changing the form of communication, changes the manner and substance of our interactions with one another. Particularly, the increased dependence on digitally mediated communications, be that email, blogs, feeds, social media platforms, video, texts, messaging, shared images, means we spend less time face-to-face in real-time conversations, where it's possible to see and respond to the person in front of us. And I want to focus on how that change of media from face-to-face to digital impacts the manner in which we relate. Technology impacts the relational capacities of adolescents, particularly, who are just learning the fine-tuned skills of relating. To assist in this discussion, I want to turn to the works of Dana Boyd and Sherry Turkle, both of whom tend to be more measured in their interpretations and their research on digital media. In It's Complicated, The Social Lives of Networked Teens, Boyd argues that, by and large, teens use technology to understand and to fit into their social worlds. So Boyd has always studied adolescents and asking them what their use is and why they use it. Based on her research, she finds that teens are not obsessed with the technology, they're obsessed with the social, connecting and fitting in with their peers. The task of fitting in, she claims, is the same tasks adolescents have been doing for generations, even before the platforms changed with time. Boyd's finding coheres with my claim that adolescence is when we first recognize the social, because we've suddenly become self-conscious. We suddenly see ourselves socially, so we need to figure out where we fit in. In Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other, Sherry Turkle moved from an earlier, more optimistic stance concerning technology and adolescence to a stance whereby she's worried about the impact of technology on the quality of human interactions. Turkle notes the multiple ways in which technology is used to retreat from direct engagement. Let me get back there. To retreat from direct engagement so as to limit emotional availability and vulnerability. She's discovering that all people, adults, young adults, and adolescents, spend more time connecting in digital space than face-to-face than ever before. In many ways, they're moving their relationships from the physical world to a digitally mediated space. I find these two authors helpful thinking about how adolescents, and actually how all people, engage with digital technology for the purpose of relating, and how the practice of mediated interaction potentially shape relationships, and particularly for adolescents and even young adults, how they shape the learning of relating well. Right? Or to ask the question a bit differently, does a digital space provide the best space to learn how to relate well? Or do the practices of those spaces develop or undermine good relational skills? But first, there's really another issue. Perhaps our fascination with the development of communication technologies caught our attention such that we focus on it and not on something that's also, I think, very important, and that is volume. To put it a bit differently, we probably would not be so bothered by technology if we were not trying to communicate with so many people. Whereas the human population remained relatively stable for most of human history at fewer than 1 billion people until about 1800, in the past couple of centuries, the number of people on Earth has grown exponentially to exceed 7 billion. While there are potentially robust and important discussions on what that population explosion means for justice and care, think of things like food production and distribution, political access, healthcare, those sorts of things. Rather, I simply want to focus on the sheer volume of people we each encounter in the course of a day, a week, or a month, whether face-to-face or through digitally mediated technologies. Why is this important? Just a few hundred years ago, an adolescent would have met a few hundred people in the course of his or her young life. Today, the average adolescent in the United States has the capacity, and more importantly, the expectation to connect with that many people in a single day. All of us in this hall have hundreds, if not thousands of contacts, friends, family, professional interests, interest-based connections. Some of them are dear to us, but many of them are barely known. Regardless, each connection demands something of us, some obligation of attention. While neither Turkle nor Boyd comment on the volume of connections, I believe that the retreat from direct engagement that they identify is in part an effort to manage the volume of encounters and connections that we have in our lives. The technologies allow us to connect more expediently with individuals through email, messaging, texts, or to more people by sharing more widely through social media, online forums, blogs, feeds. In fact, maybe perhaps the greatest gift of apps and this technology is its capacity to manage hundreds of thousands of connections which we like and follow. Our efforts through digitally mediated communications attempt to make up for the fact that we have limited space with most of these face-to-face. However, while the technology helps us manage the current volume of connections, it also encourages an expansion of that volume. It takes very little effort to include one more recipient on an email, add one more friend, or follow someone new. Yet each adds expectations, whether emailing, following, or posting, of time, attention, and interest. I exhaust myself every time I think about this. Just think about my email coming in every day and my Facebook feeds. Within some communities, there can be repercussions for not engaging with as many people as possible, as often as possible, through the various media that become available. And this is particularly true of adolescents who want to be on the same platforms as their peers so as to feel part of the community. In the midst of the volume, speed, mobility, and plurality of connections in contemporary life, it's easy to meet multiple fascinating people and to revel in the world of possibilities. Digital technology allows us to follow with others far and wide, to connect with people that we don't know, and to maintain connections over time and distance with those we no longer see face to face. The technology becomes a tool of managing the volume of relationships, and our use of the technology also becomes a means of dealing with too little time together. According to Boyd, this is particularly true of adolescents today, whose lives are scheduled from beginning to end of day, with almost no free, unstructured time with their age peers. Reflect on these questions. How did you spend your day and evening as an adolescent? With whom? Where did you spend it? What were you doing? An important piece of this, how did you get around? Think about that for a moment. How did you spend your afternoons and evenings as an adolescent? All of you. All right. Now, for some of you, the next one's not going to be too different, but I think this is an important thing to ask. What are the answers for teens today to those same questions? How is a 15-year-old spending his or her time today? When school ends, where does he or she go? With whom? Where? And how do they get around? An important question in this is, where is the free, unstructured social time in either of these equations? All right, again, let's take a moment with yourselves. What comes to mind here as you're looking at the distinction in how time is spent between maybe a 15, 16, 17-year-old growing up today and your own adolescence, whether that was recently or a little while ago. Okay, take a moment. We're going to actually ask for some feedback at this point. We have Colleen's got a microphone. I want to just kind of ask, what are things you've noticed? You notice a difference in how time is spent. Or if you want to just say, this is how, and it may be more interesting to start with somebody who was born before 1970, starting there, say, how was your afternoon and evening spent, with whom, where? Colleen, wait for the mic over here.
Grew up in upstate New York,
Okay.
rural. You were either at school or home. The only way you got to other friends, the immediate neighborhood was by bike, but farther away it was by car, so you had to wait until parents could do that. But mom was home, and mom had a car.
Okay.
And so that made a huge difference with how you could spend your time. And the thing with the telephone, I remember being on the phone for 4.5 hours with my friend, because that's how you would spend your time in the afternoons. You'd talk on the phone.
But that phone was in your household. And
Yes.
Where did you sit while you were talking on the phone? Or where did
In
you
the
hang?
kitchen.
In the kitchen.
And you could get out into the, if you really were talking about something private, it went around the corner into the garage.
The cord
And
was
so
long
you could
enough,
go and
right.
talk in the garage and hope that nobody could hear you in the kitchen.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just last month, I replaced my in-laws' really worn-out long cord
Yeah.
that they said was worn out years ago by my brother-in-law, Al, who was under the dining room table talking to his girlfriend from the kitchen phone. Good example. Okay. Somebody else also from the ancient of days. Actually. Right.
I grew up also in upstate New York, but in Rochester, which is more suburban. And after school, we got on the bus, after school we went to sports. Everybody went to sports at the same time. You didn't get home from sports unless you took the bus. No parents ever drove to the schools. So your sports were done, you took the bus home, and then you went out and played dodgeball or jumped on we biked everywhere. And then the evenings I was on the phone, my pink dial phone in my bedroom.
Ooh, she had her own phone.
Which was
very modern.
Well, I mean, I shared my room with my sister, so it depended if she was there, whether I was going to be on the phone or not. But Yeah, and that's what I did. And what we were discussing here is that we knew what to do when we were bored. I didn't have tons of homework, so when my homework was done, I was listening to, or watching Dark Shadows or something, or listening to the radio. And,
Yep.
So
Okay.
we were bored, and we had to be creative to find out what to do next.
Which indicates you had free time. You had free time to do that sort of thing, so hanging out with friends. Okay, and here?
There was one other contrast that I am aware of. When I was growing up, because you came home at the same time, then more evenings you had dinner together.
Yes.
During the weekdays.
Yes.
And so then weekends didn't feel as needed to like make sure we were together as a family because we had seen each other through the week. And I'm aware of my discomfort when we go the whole week and have not all sat down together, or there are too many fragmented evenings. And so then I hold on to those weekend evenings really tight because there's no other time. So it's a difference because the week is more fragmented.
Very good, thank you. So pay attention. Notice how social time is spent and with whom. Okay, let's hear from somebody who's more representative of, now. Or lives in that world, whether as a parent or as a young adult yourself. How does your afternoon spent, your evening, with whom, where? They're shyer. You are not a young adult. You have 4, okay.
Thanks. Yeah, the contrast would be similar to the last two about lots of free time in the evenings in high school. I wouldn't usually get home till 7 or 8 at night. We're at friends' houses, at the library, just doing things freely. With my own kids from 17 down to 9, extremely structured, and not structured in the way we were talking about with, sports teams together at the school for a couple hours as much as running to dance class or to work or to tutor or going places by themselves and not home for dinner and not really ever home during the week to meet a friend for anything.
Very good, thank you. Anybody else want to reflect that? Hold on. Okay. And that'll be our.
I am also not of this time, but I have 3 kids of my own. And I think the biggest difference I see is having the alone time to make decisions on your own, to have the freedom to get around. I mean, as a kid, I walked everywhere, and I know with my older children, if they lived when I did, they would be walking everywhere. And now it's sort of thinking, ooh, she's letting their kids go do that? There's danger out there. And I think giving kids the opportunity to stumble and pick themselves up, I feel like is sort of missing for my own children.
Okay. Thank you. So thank you very much. And next time around, maybe we'll hear from somebody who's like under 30. It's okay. We're a friendly audience, kind of. All right. So what do I want to, I want to notice a couple of things there. There's a very different way in which we spend time. There is no free time in the same kind of way. And I suggest that that's not necessarily driven by the individual's choice, but in fact by other bigger agendas or bigger narratives that are in the culture. One of the huge narratives, and I heard it yesterday when I was working with a student, he and I were having a conversation, and I said, I had a job at 15. I worked at a deli. I had to get my working papers, and he said, was that unusual? I'm like, no, everybody had a job. All my siblings had jobs, and I said, if I wasn't in sports at school, and if I was in sports at school, I'd be home by 4:30, 5 o'clock. I walked to school, walked back. I walked with friends back and forth to school. If not, I went to work, spent a few hours at work, worked on the weekends at a job, worked with adults and people who are my age peers. It was a really different kind of setting, and he was saying that, well, he never had a job because he was busy building a resume. And I thought, I was building a resume. I had a job. Hello? That's a resume builder. I had the same, and I worked at this deli through into college. On college breaks, I'd come home and work on the holidays. But the interesting thing is there's a compulsion, a cultural compulsion, that people have to be constantly building building resumes from preschool on. See that 5-month-old there in the back of the room is building the resume. She's going to write down she went to this continuing ed event, and it's going to help her get into the preschool of her choice. Okay, so these are important social narratives that push our behavior, sometimes unreflectively. We're saying, well, the best thing we need to do is help our kids get into the best places. And I'm suggesting to you that, in fact, that social narrative that says resume building is the most important thing we do, in fact, is a false narrative. The things that help people actually succeed in their jobs and in school and whatever, their relationships, is their capacity to relate well with other human beings. It's their capacity to be relational instead of instrumental thinkers. You can have an extraordinary resume and be an instrumental thinker. You can get to be running for political office and be a very savvy instrumental thinker. You can be old and be an instrumental thinker and be really lousy at relationships, really lousy at recognizing the connections between your actions and other people's lives, the impact of yourself on other people. Okay? Because those skills of relating are learned in relationships. They're not learned in programs. They're not learned necessarily in school in a class. They're learned in the interactions among real people. Okay? So, when we looked at the difference between how unstructured free time is used, it actually, there is a big difference, right? And this is an important point that the Turkle's going to make. Where the unstructured free time with interests with others, if you don't have free time to build relationships with other people, then it can be difficult to have a sense of being known and knowing other people. Right? If you're always busy about the agenda or the task at hand, like for many of us in my generation, growing up and being on sports teams was not about college scholarships. It was just about hanging out in the afternoon with friends and, maybe you got just playing, having a good chance to play. But now too often, our adolescents are involved in activities for the sake of making the activity pay off later. Okay? And another interesting element of it is that these activity groups are usually separate spheres of people. So as a few of you mentioned, I stayed after school, this woman over here, everybody stayed after school to do sports. So it's the same community of kids meeting in the afternoon in a different kind of environment. What's different now is that kids today may be involved in different environments, but they actually go to different places. So there I'm going to my tutor over here, I'm going to my cello lesson over here, I'm going to track over here, I'm going to the traveling soccer team over there, and there may be overlaps of some of the people, but very often not. And so you don't have overlapping communities of people, which then makes the relational skills building that much harder, just because you're spending less time with, if this makes sense, less time with more people. Okay. In that regard, you'd think technology would be a help in that it allows for speedy communication with many people, even those at a great distance. But does it always help? Is really the question. There's certainly a place for technological communication, and unquestionably there's an allure to it, but the opportunities it offers are not always aids. For adolescents and young adults in the early 21st century, digital communications has been part of their lives from very early, and it is increasingly the mode through which they interact throughout their day. But contrary to popular assumptions, Boyd argues most teens are not compelled by gadgetry as such, they are compelled by friendship. The gadgets are interesting to them primarily as means to a social end. But Boyd argues that what makes this digital technology different from parents' and grandparents' phone or car is that it allows them to connect with peers with whom they have limited, unstructured, unmonitored face-to-face time. So remember those walks home from school, that time on the bus, that hanging out in the locker room, being at work flipping hamburgers with people and other people at McDonald's. That in some ways was unstructured, unmonitored social time. A 2015 study from the Pew Research Center found that 92% of teens between 13 and 17 go online daily, and as much as 56% multiple times a day, with African American and Hispanic youth the most frequent internet users. Now, Pew questions how access to technology divides along racial and economic lines in their studies, and the same report found that African American teens are the most likely of any group of teens to have a smartphone, with 85% having access to one, compared with 71% of most white and Hispanic teens. Right? Whether this access is good or bad is debated among various voices, and my point is that this is where most teens spend their time, online, on their phones, hoping to connect with friends. This is where they hang out. So the social media space becomes the hangout space, not the park bench, not the walk home. We all use technology. Everybody in this room uses technology. You've signed up for this session on technology. We all use it. But the question is, how do you do it? How do you manage your connections? What do you use? With whom do you use what? Friends, work colleagues, family. Right? And what are the benefits and what are the costs? I suggest that everybody who uses technology recognizes its costs as well as recognizes its benefits. But they take them as givens. These just are. I gotta live with it. And I suggest, why don't we raise it to the level of a question is like, well, do we have to just do it, or is there a way of doing it that makes it different, can make it different for us? So again, let's take a moment for yourself. What do you use, how do you use it, and for what? All right, I'd like to take just a couple of moments. This is before our break. So you say, oh good, there's a break. I can refresh my coffee. Get another one of those coffee cakes. I just want to take a break and see, what are we thinking so far? What's going on in the room, in your head? We've talked about kind of we've had two parts so far, but I'm thinking, what's occurring to you? All of us are implicated in this, is probably one of the things I want to underline. All of us are implicated in this. Technology impacts our relationships. What are you thinking so far? John? Any thoughts? Again, doesn't have to be a fully, here we go, there's someone.
What I'm noticing is that, so I am the director of youth and young adult ministry for our diocese in Worcester, and I'm noticing that some of our faith formation leaders in the parishes are thinking, we can't get them there anyways, so why don't we just go to a completely online a medium to get the information across from them, and then we'll gather a couple times during the year. And so that asks some of the questions: what are the benefits, what are the costs? Is it going to be seen just as yet another task? And of course the company that's promoting it, I understand that they're really trying to help, but on the other hand, is this really only fostering that sort of distance relationship from their church and the community, and how is that helping them to encounter Christ? So just wary of that, but seeing, okay, is there a way to combine that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question is going to be, how does it get used? Other thoughts? What's occurring to folks? There's one up here. Two up there.
I live in Salem, New Hampshire, and we have a drug epidemic that I know you all know is going on. And the task force working in our town has done extensive research with teens, asking them, why are you turning to these drugs? And they're saying that they're bored. That's the number one reason across the board. And so then the logical question is, but aren't you overcommitted? Yes, we're overcommitted, but there's no meaning in any of what we're doing. Mm-hmm. And what you're saying connects in so perfectly is that they have all these things, but there's no relationship. And so they're turning to something to give them pleasure when they should be turning to each other. And it speaks for all of us, like you said, but it's so connecting in with what we've been working on in our parish and in our town.
Yeah.
So thank you for helping make that connection so clear.
Thank you. And I think that's a really important thing. If this is the world you're growing up in, it's hard not to think this is it. This is it. This is as good as it gets. And that's really problematic. You say, well, it's just more and more busyness, you know.
I have two teenage girls, 15 and 17, and one in particular was an avid reader to the point that even at 16 I had to limit her reading because she would be reading at the dinner table. Has a boyfriend now and is never off her phone, and he's very digitally connected. So it's totally changed her reading. It's changed. She's a great kid, very smart kid, but it's been a huge challenge. And she, you know, they talk about how much the screen at night. She does FaceTime at night with him, and it's just been it's been a huge challenge.
You know, once books were considered a new technology. Yeah. And I'm just noticing how you're saying she wants to read at the table, you know, and those of us who are used to having dinner regularly with family, you wouldn't imagine reading at the table. You would imagine coming to the table with a book and being told immediately, that's not for here, you know. So there's a sense of having, and there always has been, I want to underline this, there have always been social rules around social engagement. And so we have to recognize that today is no different. We need to have social rules around how humans engage. And so rules around the use of technology are completely appropriate, and not only appropriate, necessary for the success of people socially. All right, there was this woman over here.
What you've discussed so far made me think of my own sons. They're 27 and 31, and I see a vast difference between the two of them in just a span of 4 years as to their social skills. The older one, very into technology. He's actually a computer engineer, but he lets go of it. The younger one will sit at the table and have his smartphone. You're like, please put your phone down. Please put your phone down. He can't let go of it. From a work perspective, I'm a director of religious education. With our 9th and 10th graders, they can't even let that phone leave their hand. So if we're in a classroom setting, I have to ask them, please put your cell phone in the center of the table for this 1 hour, and someone inevitably will like grab the phone, stick it inside their sweatsuit, you know, and look at it, like let it go. So they're not focusing on whatever it is that we're doing because I have to be so connected to the phone, even to the detriment of them learning things that you take for granted. One time I couldn't see what time it was and the clock was on the wall, and I said, Susan, can you tell me what time it is? I can't see. Oh, I can only read digital. I can't read analog. I was like, what? What?
Yeah.
So those kind
Yeah,
of
we're
issues.
going to, after the break, what we'll talk about is what are the particular practices of the use of technology. And these are practices we all have. So it's not, you know, we're only casting aspersions on ourselves by saying, yeah, we all do this stuff. And we have to pay attention to what it is that we're doing so we can be more mindful practitioners with the use of technology. Yeah. And there's the one in the very back of the room there. We'll take that one. And oh, there's two. All right, we'll take two. But this woman by the coffee cake was first, I think. She'd be the woman by the coffee cake. Raise your hand again. She doesn't. Oh. Right.
Hi. What I'm seeing is that the technology has set up this kind of bad road where people can falsify information about themselves. And like I see my daughter trying to meet people online, and I'm like, you don't know anything about these people, and they present themselves in a certain way. And I've tried to teach her to do a little more investigating and dig a little deeper to find out more about these people. And sometimes it's not information that she really out.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think, you know, like I think of like Facebook, even people try to present themselves in a certain way. Everything is, you know, wonderful and all, and people don't see real life.
Yep.
And so when she meets other people, you know, she's not meeting them in a real sense, you know, and doesn't have the capacity to really develop a true deep relationship with them. And also I think there's something lacking in just the lack of physicality. You know, when you physically see someone, I mean, they say communication, most of communication is, you know, physically. And so when you see someone, you know, and you can see that there's a real connection. And so I think physical,
Yep.
you know, with head movements, eye movements, and
Yeah, we'll talk about what is the impact of what I call an invisible audience, or what actually both of the researchers call an invisible audience. What does it mean when you're talking to people that you can't see and can't verify? Okay, but that'll be after the break. See, reason to stay, reason to stay. And one last comment before, ooh, look, somebody who looks like she might be under 30.
Yeah.
Yay.
I'm
Okay.
21.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And I've been speaking all lies, right? No. Okay, no. And I've been speaking all lies, right? No.
No. There's
Okay.
there's a lot of truth, but I figured someone under 30 should talk at some point. So it's me. So I just want to just say, one, I consider myself a social media moderate to light person. I try not to have too many apps on my phone because I don't like being notified all the time. But I will say, so my mom and my two sisters are all on Snapchat, and that's like one way that we communicate in a pretty meaningful way. My little sister is very Snapchat active. That's probably the #1 way that I communicate with her. And so I think there are real benefits to that. But at the same time, you know, just my mom is single and has been dating kind of on and off. And just there've been so many funny moments where she's been the teenager and we've been the parent almost. Like she's into some new guy and like has her phone at the dinner table and we're like, excuse me. We weren't allowed to do that in high school, so like you need to put your phone away. So there have just been things like that. No one's exempt. I think in that way it is like her desire for connection and the social part of it. It's not that she's, you know, ignoring us for the sake of herself. But yeah, so just to bring that to light.
Thank you. That's a great place to take a pause, because what I'm pointing to is that the technologies are promising aid in your relational life, whether those relationships are with work colleagues, people with similar interests to yourself, close friends, family members. It can be a tremendous aid. But it also can undermine the very relationships you're trying to develop, just by the nature of the technology itself and the practices we follow or we fall into to use them. So that's a great example. So we always have to be mindful, how am I using the technology? And it's not just how are kids using that technology, it's how am I using that technology, how am I inviting other people to use that technology. You know, just as my parents had rules around the landline phone and the use of the family car, there got to be rules around these things, and those shouldn't be considered as taboo. Those should be considered normative, normal. And to figure out what those are, those are going to be the part of the challenge. So let's take a break here, refresh your coffee, get that great coffee cake, and we'll come back in a little bit and continue. It's really great to see familiar faces in the room. It's also always good to meet new people, so I appreciate you all for being here and being part of this discussion. So in part one, just a little refresher because, you know, it's always helpful. What were we doing? In part one, I talked about how we're made for relationships. Living lovingly into relationships is our highest good and hope. I said that adolescents are only just coming to the point in their life where they begin to recognize relationships such that they can begin to live into them more intentionally. Second, we discussed how adolescence and technology have always been linked, at least in the last century, in advance of social relations. Whether the technology was the home phone, the family car, or the smartphone. And then I talked about the volume of connections in our lives and how the technology is terrific for managing that volume, those tens and thousands of connections. And it also makes it easy, maybe too easy, to just add more. Okay? So in this part, we're going to investigate the practices of digital technology And these are my reflections based on the research of Boyd and Turkle. And I'm going to make 6 points, identifying some of the challenges of the technology to how we actually relate with one another. Digital communication technologies continuously promise to help our relationships, but the practice of these technologies can in fact undermine the very goals they promise. Okay, so first of all, I love my device. The first relationship is with the technology itself. Some people already referenced that in the comments that they make. And it's a love-hate relationship, where we love the technology for how and with whom it can connect us. We keep up with people's news events, even if we're not able to spend time with them face to face. But we hate it when it fails to work as we hope, when it pulls us in too many directions, when it pulls us away from the present, and when we're ignored by others who are so pulled, noting the comment that was shared before the break. The devices themselves become the portal through which relationships are experienced. For some, the separation from the device is felt as a separation from companionship and security. Thus, the relationship with the device becomes immediate, and that with the people becomes mediated. Years ago, when I was doing my master's degree here in Boston, I lived in a residence with another student from Sydney, Australia. And each Sunday, she eagerly awaited phone calls from home on a landline in her room. And she confessed to me once that the phone was her most valuable possession in that room because it linked her to the one she loved. And when she left at the end of her studies, she gave me the phone and the small table that held it. It was a prized possession of hers, but she handed it on because it was no longer needed since she was going to see these people face to face. We have long loved the technologies that have connected us to important others, whether the home phone, the mailbox, or the message board, and some of us have spent undue time sitting by that phone or a mailbox in the hopes of some news. But because those things were stationary, we were usually persuaded to move along to other pursuits. But today, the technology allows us to connect from anywhere by simply taking our devices with us. Yet the promise of constant virtual connections render us absent to the real connections around us. Turkle writes of the devices rendering us absent to the immediate because of our constant tethering to the lives of those not physically present. She writes this: "A place used to compromise a physical space and the people within it. What is a space if those who are physically present have their attention on the absent? At a cafe a block from my home," she writes, "almost everyone is on a computer or a smartphone as they drink their coffee. These people are not my friends, yet somehow I miss their presence." I saw a perfect example of this 2 Sundays ago at the Pavement Cafe on Com Ave by BU. The room was full to capacity of young people, and all of them had some form of screen in front of them. So it was as silent as a library. The same was true when I came into this room today and passed through the dining hall. There was, at every table, without exception, there was some form of screen there, whether it was actively in use or just waiting. Okay? Turkle notes that our public spaces have become places of social connection, but not to those physically there. The very tool designed to connect us is used as a means to avoid face-to-face contact. Even if a device sits on a table, it represents potential interruptions. It pings, rings, vibrates, or glows, and attention is taken from the immediate in favor of the mediated. Furthermore, the mediated formats have a potential to, or have a tendency, I should say, to flatten the relationships. While Boyd found that most teens use a plethora of social media services as they navigate relationships and contexts, addressing different distinct audiences on each platform, I would argue that the modes shape the communication. Texts and messaging, used for more private communication, tend to be abbreviated interchanges, whereas the more public forums, social media, blogs, feeds, offer longer space for communiques, but a scattershot means of broadcasting. So frequently, important relations receive the same information and in the same format as those less intimate. And this isn't to suggest that we don't have some affection for all our connections, but the constant use of this media blurs the distinction among them. Finally, if you spend most of your time in mediated relationships, we advantage that format and disadvantage the skills of face-to-face. Simply, we get good at what we practice. We can easily become unreflective users following the technology and other people's expectations for it to drive how it is used. We can lose sight of our relational objectives. That which is designed to keep us connected becomes a means of disconnection from or a partial attention to what is really important to us. We need to be mindful of how we differentiate among the tens, hundreds, or thousands of connections such that we nurture and are nurtured by the few that are really important. So rather than simply avoid mediated forms of relating, we may have to develop practices around their use that actually help us and do not undermine the relationships they're designed to serve. Take a moment and think about that. How do you know that to be true? How does the technology itself interrupt? How does the device shape the mode and the content of the interchange? Let me move on to my second point, and that is looking for control or avoiding vulnerability. The technology is great for offering control, we think. Right? Our Pavlovian response to those rings and buzzes and vibrations suggests that we welcome the constant intrusion, but do we? Turkle observed something interesting. She observed an increased aversion to the immediacy of live phone conversation. She noticed a shift to preferring texts, messaging, and other forms that create space in the interaction, such that we can keep our emotional responses at a distance from the immediate interchange. The mediated space, in some places, in some ways, promises greater control than the face-to-face. Right? Through texts or posts, we can be selective about what we disclose. Our face is not available to be seen. Our feelings are not obvious. We can react to others invisibly. We do not have to trust the other or ourselves. The technology, she was discovering for many users, created a buffer. She found this particularly among adolescent girls she was studying. She writes, "These young women prefer to deal with strong feelings from the safe haven of the net. It gives them an alternative to processing emotions in real time. Under stress, they seek composure above all, but they do not find equanimity," she discovers. Turkle repeatedly found that adolescents in particular use mediated forms to sidestep the immediacy and vulnerability of emotions. They claim that texting offers protection. However, the protection might be an illusion, for they create a new pressure of appearing constantly composed. In this, you can see, or I can discern, two related desires. One is to present oneself flawlessly, and the other is to respond flawlessly. Yet, this desire to control is illusory. In other writing, Boyd argues that these digital bodies are fundamentally coarser, making it far easier to misinterpret what someone is expressing. So while the young author may be selective in what he has shared, he's not able to see how it's interpreted. So he cannot respond immediately with corrections or explanations. Even if the exchange isn't almost real time, like text messaging, the physical absence of the reader allows for the possibility of the intended reader to invite other unseen readers. And the private exchange is no longer private. Unintended readers can read and offer their anonymous reactions to the original posting before the originators had a chance to even explain themselves or clarify or correct. The technology allows too easy an escape from the awkwardness or time consumption of face-to-face real-time encounters. While initially attractive, such avoidance means we may never overcome the awkwardness or become less self-conscious in the engagement. What seems like avoidance is really only postponement. And let's face it, we are all awkward until we're not. We learn the skills of conversation in the exercise of conversation, especially in intimate settings like those among friends and family. If we limit face-to-face conversation to lighthearted banter or brief exchanges, then the subtle and careful skills of conversation in more trying, loaded, or difficult moments remain a mystery, not only for those intimate settings, but also for public engagement. By avoiding the face-to-face, we also miss potential moments for affection and grace that can come with such encounters. Think about that for yourselves now. How does the digital media tempt you to present your best face? Does your Facebook feed tell the whole story? Why not? All right, I'm going to just take a second now, more than a second. But I've made just 2 points so far. The control and vulnerability and the relationship with the device itself. And on just those 2 points, is there anything occurring to anybody? Let's just take a pause and see what's stirring in the room. There's a hand there? No, you need the mic. We need the mic.
I don't really know if it has anything to do with either one, but somehow when you were talking about the love of the device, and this memory came back to me, and I've seen it happen several times, and it just breaks my heart every time I see it. I'm in a restaurant, I look at a table next to me, there's a parent, most often single, with maybe a 4 or 5-year-old child, and the parent is totally focused in on the phone, and the kid is just kind of sitting there, kind of eating, kind of looking around, and I find myself engaging with that child,
Yeah.
making and it's just, I want to like go over to the parent and just, oh my God, look who you have in front of you, please, and what is that child learning as you're sitting there ignoring? I mean, and this would go on for 20 minutes.
Mm-hmm. 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 I'd like to point out, it's so much easier to notice in other people's behavior. But it's Yeah, but it's hard to notice. That's the trick, is we have to notice ourselves. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm doing this. I'm so sorry. Put this away. Put this away. Over there, and then there was one here.
So thinking about the preference for texting versus being face-to-face or talking on the phone, I think time is another thing. At least I know I feel it, and my peers hate voicemails and never listen to voicemails, and if it's really important, just shoot me a text, and then I'll see that and reply to it. So I don't know if that, I don't know what that means about us, but hopefully it doesn't mean that we're too busy to make time for interactions and relationships, but I think time is also a factor, in this idea of being flawless and all that. I think that's another point.
Yeah, and that was the point I was trying to say earlier. All of this is framed by the volume of connections we have, the limitations of time that we have, all right? So I'm not, and I don't think you heard it this way, I'm not trying to find fault necessarily. I'm just saying, notice how these practices shape the relationship. And so we have to be very conscientious about our own practices with the technology, because there are moments when its use is appropriate and wonderful, and then there are moments when it gets in the way of the very relationship we're trying to do. Colleen, over on this side. There's a gentleman here who's had his hand up.
Thanks. Just yesterday, I had a conversation with a young man that I'm following down in Bridgewater State, and talking about the inability to communicate with his girlfriend through text. I mean, the long text went back and forth, and they just couldn't see eye to eye, and he or she didn't have the time to meet because they're seniors and they're about to graduate. And I'm very aware, and as you were talking, my notes talked about nonverbal communication and how that's cut out through being mediated through a text. Yeah. Not even face-to-face. Skypes do the same thing as face-to-face in reality. Yeah. So, and I was never aware of the loss of that 85% communication that's nonverbal that we always do. Mm-hmm. I'm doing it now.
Yes, you are.
I'm Italian, too. So, and that completely gets lost until technology can find a way to capture that 85%. Otherwise, it's always going to be short.
Yeah. And I don't know that technology will ever be able to, because I think that there is something that happens not only in the presence of one another, but this is something I've come to appreciate. There's something about our skin that has a receptivity or a revulsion to other people. And somehow or other, it's part of the equation. And it's something that we're not able to measure at this moment, but I think that there is something about the physicality of another person. Humans respond to other humans all the time. And it determines how closely we sit, how far apart we sit. It determines how we present ourselves. And the technology, I don't think will ever be able to capture all of that. It will capture a facsimile of it, but that facsimile our bodies will not respond to that facsimile as our bodies respond to the real human person other. We are incarnated, so. Actually, I want to go over there. These two have talked. We'll get back to you two. Let's try something new.
So I go to grad school, and it's 100% online. And our classroom discussion is based on discussion boards. Mm-hmm. So it reminds me of this flawless performance. I can say whatever I want. I can have so much time to think about it. And then I was in a group project with these people that I've had these online discussions for 2 months straight. And we got in this Google Hangout. And I'm telling you, it was the most awkward thing. We all stood there and we're like, who's gonna talk first? So you can see everyone's faces. But it's going with this whole postponed awkwardness, right? We're on this educational setting. We're all learning about the same things. But the first time we go face to face after discussing things online, it was extremely awkward. And I was like, hey guys. And then, from there we slowly but surely gain those, that emotional connection with actually the face-to-face talking. But that initial thing was kind of like a spark with what you're saying. Yeah.
Now let me ask you, did you have discussion board conversations after the fact? And did you know anything different about those discussions, even in your own mind, now that you knew what the people looked like, sounded like?
Yes, definitely. Because I think when you have those face-to-face, you have more personal conversations. Oh, at my school I'm doing this. And they're all across the country. One was I was talking to this guy from Pepperdine, and I think seeing his whole view of things were very different. And so I think one girl, I got her number, we were texting about something, so it even brought that step further. And now I'll call her if I have a question about something. So just that whole face-to-face.
Yeah.
But it still was through technology, but the benefits of seeing them.
Yeah, yeah. Having a sense of who the person is, thank you very much. Having a sense of who the person is, physically, visually, tactilely, is so important to our sense not only of the other person, but of ourselves. Because we are responsive, even if we don't even notice we're being responsive. Many people, for example, go on, do online dating now. Online dating is great for volume. Again, it's great for volume. Meet a lot of people, somewhere in there may be somebody. Okay, great. I did it. I said, I got very good at first dates. I said it was like an interview. The interview point is, do we want a second date? But what I discovered was that between the time of making the initial connection digitally and the face-to-face encounter, my imagination about them and my life would go absolutely wild. It was a fertile field. And then I'd meet them and say, what? Not so much. So I always say to people, now, if you're doing online, meet as soon as possible. As soon as possible. We have to, there's something about the human need to see the other, be in the presence of the other. Okay? But what's interesting about it is that the technology allows us easy ways to escape from the present with each other. And that's what Turkle was finding here. It's like, how is it that we can all be in the same space and have no sense of who it is we're with? Because, and she was discovering this, the awkwardness of that meeting with real people we want to avoid. And at the same time, the allure of other relationships, other interesting things is calling us through the device. And so we're caught in that space. Right. All right, let's continue on. I'm sure you have more to say, which is really wonderful. But let's continue on. Invisible audiences, this was raised earlier. In part, the desire to present a flawless image comes from not really knowing at any given moment to who you're communicating and the context of that communication's reception. Most adolescents, and even mature adults, imagine they know the audience of their digitally mediated communications, even though the readers and the settings in which the readings are being done is invisible. Adolescents and young adults usually share texts, messages, and social media with people they know face-to-face, usually. However, those are readable and available to countless others. We've all been in the situation of sharing with other people what was shared with us on our device. In a different way, adolescents and young adults compose blogs, personal web pages, and feeds as means of identity exploration and expression. And they want to find audiences beyond the people they know face-to-face. Another technology researcher, Susanna Stern, reports that creators usually identify themselves as the primary audience of their writings, similar to someone who keeps a journal or a diary. They're writing themselves into self-reflection. And secondarily, creators seek validation from invisible sources, invisible audiences. Right? Even if they're displayed in public sites available to unknown others, adolescents perceive of their postings as private communications that should only be read by people who they want and should exclude those who they don't want. They're very often surprised that people that they know have read what they wrote in a public space. Okay? While this clearly raises issues for security, and that's usually what most parents think of, I suggest it also raises a question of responsibility. Responsibility is learned within the context of relationships. Relational settings foster the development of care and concern, as well as communicate the particulars of acceptable and unacceptable behavior. However, invisible audiences are easier to dismiss. Stern's research shows that there's a tendency among teen authors to ignore the comments of invisible others. Similarly, Turkle notes that when we encounter people who do not interest us or with whom we disagree, there's a dispatch with which we treat them, such that we invent ways of being with people such that we turn them into something close to things. We only want them to be mirrors reflecting our best selves back to us. Such dismissal is also evident, I believe, in cyberbullying, wherein the consequences of a young person's participation is not immediately seen, thus can remain invisible to them as perpetrators. All they're only aware of is that they've done what everybody wants them to do and have no sense of how it impacted somebody else. Regular engagement with a largely invisible audience raises multiple relational questions. To what degree, if at all, am I responsible to the unseen and largely unknown audience? To whom am I responsible? How do I learn to care for them? Should I care, especially if they don't reciprocate that care? Do I have to listen to them if I disagree or if they criticize? Am I responsible if somebody gets hurt? Developing a sense of responsibility is connected with developing a sense of care for others. Care and responsibility reflect a person's capacity to move beyond self-interest to see and learn to attend to the needs of others. However, we need to come to know the other, who they are, what they feel, what's important to them, in order to respond appropriately. Furthermore, and this is something that's been said here a couple of times, we develop emotional intelligence, how to read the subtlety of emotions over time in face-to-face encounters. When the other remains invisible and anonymous, these opportunities are missing. Rather, one is encouraged to reflect only on oneself, how one is perceived and validated as the only player in the exchange. The invisible audience lacked the prompts of care and lacked the prompts and the motivation of care and responsibility beyond oneself. They encourage self-consciousness, but not necessarily self-awareness. By that I mean self-consciousness, the awareness that other people see you and you are seen, but self-awareness being an ability to recognize your impact in the lives of other people. But also about that invisible audience. Are they real? Right? So the invisible audience is not only consequential for how we respond to them, but also for what they offer us. Since invisible audiences lack context, we don't know where they are and if they're real or fictitious, or if their responses are automatic or authentic. Both Stern and Boyd write of how important online affirmations are to young authors. But how do we know if those affirmations are authentic? Similarly, Turkle finds that users frequently invest in digital connections while simultaneously wondering if those connections are real people. We play to the invisible audience while being unsure of the audience's validity. And this puts us in a double bind. We work for their validation while questioning its real value, but too scared to move in a new direction and risk losing what we have. We present who we believe the others want to see while remaining unsure of whether their affirmation that we present, that they present is real. It's a crazy little double bind. Let me try something out, I get affirmation, but is that affirmation real? And would they really like who I really am? Turkle found that avatars and profiles and blogs and feeds seem to offer something valuable, but it remains largely unconfirmed, if not backed up by real people in real lives. We wonder if the exchanges are authentic representations of someone's thoughts and feelings. Are they performative efforts designed to elicit responses? Are they simply habitual and thoughtless reactions? Like, left swipe, right swipe, left swipe. Or are they marketing tools to garner market research or consumer loyalty? Their values as sincere affirmations remain questionable without confirmation in an eventual face-to-face encounter. The reality and value of the affirmation can only be tested when the anonymity ends. Humans need the love and concern of others. We need affirmation and connection. But it raises the question of whose approval do we seek? How widely do we seek it? And should that affirmation come without challenge or critique? Do I listen only to those who like what I have to say, to those who agree? Can I dismiss those who challenge me, who disagree, who are unkind? If I seek out anonymous others, believing that it's easier than facing real people in real life, is their approval real? Are they real? Which, of course, leads to the next question. Am I real? On the other side, we can ask, is our representation fully authentic? Dana Boyd celebrates digital sites as spaces where adolescents can explore the sense of self without the consequence of immediate reactions. She writes that websites, social media, and blogs seem to allow adolescents more control online. They choose what information to put forward, thereby eliminating visceral reactions that might have seeped out in everyday communication. Similarly, Turkle notes that mediated formats invite a certain performance in what one chooses to be made public. These modes allow one to edit or curate your life so that it may appear more attractive to audiences. The technology also allows for designing particular persona for distinct audiences. Those audiences can remain separate and ignorant of different conflicting persona. We omit what we think will not appeal, or we shape ourselves into what we believe people want. We can try things out in ways that we never would in front of people we know. Now, this can be liberating, especially if we're unsure of acceptance among our immediate community. Granted, as a young adolescent begins to become self-conscious of being seen by others, it's natural to try on different persona and to see how they feel and how others respond. It's very natural. Thus, the possibility of limited and selected exposure and the absence of consequences are initially attractive. But if the bridge to the face-to-face is never made, it can contribute to further isolation. If she lives a fractured life and she fears not being accepted for who she really is, ultimately our satisfaction comes in being known fully and accepted, not partially but fully. And this is the value of acceptance found in the interactions with people who really know you in your real life. Right? It doesn't mean to say that everybody in our real life really values and accepts us all the time, but when that happens, that is extraordinarily valuable. Okay. Our life's work, initiated in adolescence, is to begin to make sense of various parts of ourselves: family, history, race, religion, ethnicity, education, socioeconomic status, sexuality, talents, interests, and see them as an integrated whole. That is our life's work. To take these elements and make them more cohesive. And they're constantly shifting in their importance and intensity. And we are aided in that integration by living amid people who see the multiple facets of ourselves. Even the people of Nazareth had to ask of Jesus, is he not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James and Josie and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us? I think it's worth noting that Jesus denies none of that. His return to Nazareth suggests that all parts of his life make up who he is and how he was understood. Right. The sixth point, the last of them, distracted from myself. There's some laughing, nodding. Throughout this talk, I focused on the way digitally mediated communication shapes how we relate to others, but it also shapes how we relate to ourselves. This siren song of technology is that we will find connection in the wider world, people, ideas, possibilities, and that much is very true. However, it also draws our attention away from investigating our own impressions, ideas, desires, and vulnerable self-reflection. Turkle and Boyd both write of users being constantly drawn to their devices as a means of keeping current with their worlds. However, the same devices that connect us with others can be a means of escaping from a deep encounter with ourselves. Presented with free time and the threat of facing our own thoughts, we reach for our devices to read the feeds, watch videos, listen to music, perhaps all at once, or record our own words for distribution on text or blogs. The smartphone in hand feeds into and encourages our FOMO, our fear of missing out. Our constant consumption of more public material offers a way of avoiding engaging with our private selves. In reference to the capacity for mobile technology to accelerate our efforts to connect outside ourselves, Turkle writes, rapid cycling stabilizes into a sense of co-presence. Even a simple cell phone brings us into the world of continual partial attention, which Jane referenced at the very beginning. This continual partial attention keeps us from going deeply into any single task or idea. Instead, like a water bug remaining buoyant on the surface by spreading its weight across 6 separate points, we skim over the top, working hard not to be drawn deeply into any one single point. Right? It takes the adolescent, as it does all of us, time and solitude to become aware of, then comfortable with, thoughts, feelings, and desires. It takes time for him to discern how each may change over time and circumstance, to learn what endures and what is passing. But by avoiding and remaining on the surface of his inner world, he's more likely to remain self-conscious and not work on the deeper work of self-awareness. Self-consciousness can trap him into focusing on others' reactions to him, what they think and like about him. The focus on their reactions can keep him from seeing what he understands and likes about himself, to come to identify what's true and enduring in him. It was a great story in the Boston College magazine a few months ago, and it told a story of it was a quote from a Boston College undergraduate who had the opportunity to walk the Camino of Santiago in northern Spain. He offered this reflection on the practice of silence and the absence of technology over the course of the many days. He says this is the longest time I have been with my own thoughts in my life. At home, I'm lucky if 5 minutes pass before I check my phone. Here, I can actually feel my train of thought progressing. Let's take a moment again. What rings true in all of this for you? In what ways is your technology use distracting you from your relationships? And how do you mindfully practice the use of technology? Let's take a moment to think about that. Have a chat with your immediate neighbor. Or sit and listen to yourself. Okay, let's just take a couple of responses from the group. Just a couple of thoughts, maybe from somebody we haven't heard from yet. There's one over here.
So back in June, I started at my parish as a youth minister. And one of the most interesting things is how technology plays in. It is always present. It's a constant. And we're talking about silence. And recently, I've been pushing my kids to go deeper. I work with my confirmation kids, so we're talking about 10th graders. And you can just feel there's like this urge. They have to post things. They have to check what's going on. They always have to be connected. And there's two sides to this. You know, it's one of these things that I have catechists who say, oh, they're these bad kids. We have, a phone pile because they don't listen to what's going on and they're not present. And there's a definite argument there. But there's also, I think, a beautiful thing that they want to share what's happening now. And there's this urge that, what I'm doing, even if it's literally I'm eating a salad, it's bigger than just myself. I have to tell everybody about it. I want to tell the world. And so I think it's a fine balance. It's teaching them how to use it in a way that you are really conscious of those relationships out there, because there are real people on the other side of those screens, whether or not you're talking to your friends or you're just putting stuff out there. And the way that you present yourself is so important. But then there's also the other side of, what does that silence look like? And why are we so uncomfortable in it? And I can see my kids, and I'm like, okay, we're going to close in prayer. Like, holding their phone, like, how do we close in prayer with my phone here? It's like, well, you can put your phones down, and you just wait. And they do respond. But it does change that relationship, and it changes that silence. And I think it puts us in a position where we need to wait for them to get more comfortable in that silence. And I say to them, I know this is uncomfortable. This is not something that we do. We're always connected, but right now we're going to turn our minds and our hearts to God, because that's the connection that's the most important. And your phone can break. You can drop it, in a pit, but God is always there. And so it's the relationship beyond the technology that's difficult, because it's exactly like that student said, I'm suddenly with my own thoughts. And so I just thought silence and relationship, really interesting.
Thank you. And there's a lot underneath that. What I'm hearing you saying is there's a real desire for the social. There is a real strong desire for the social. But what they're inclined to think is that the technology will facilitate the social, and it will to a degree, right? But it'll also get in the way. And they become, and we all do, we become much more comfortable with this device, whatever that device may be, and less comfortable of that unsure person who's in front of you. And so and I'm glad that you named that. There's a discomfort. And for you to name it as discomfort is helpful, because the individual is going to say, is it only me? Am I the only one who feels awkward here? And the answer is, no, we all feel awkward until we don't feel awkward. So let's help us get over it, And that's the need for a social relationship to actually assist in developing the social relationship. We're uncomfortable until we're not uncomfortable, because a lot of, not only teens, but young adults will say, I'm going to start really interacting in the world when I'm feeling more confident, because it'll all of a sudden I'll wake up one morning and I'll be sure. No. We're never sure until we've stumbled our way through the discomfort, until we feel more secure. And it's much easier to do it when you're like 16, 18, 22. It's really harder to do if you wait until you're 32 and you say, okay, now I'm ready to face the world. Oh, jeez. I told you earlier, the world expects you already have this on board. You're not just going to wake up one day fully gifted as a relational human being. You actually have to live into it and grow those skills. Okay, right here again.
I also worry about what's playing out, especially through social media. If you like, when people like to post that they have, like, say, an opinion that doesn't garner popular, it doesn't fit with popular opinion. And I think the fact that we think we can post those things and not actually get a reaction, number one, but I think the fact that we are not is hurting our public discourse, that we are not having these tough conversations. And so what we're doing is we're sticking with we're never looking deep into an issue. We're going with the sound bites.
Yeah.
And so, and sort of that developing almost like such a dislike for opposing opinions, and we're losing that ability to actually to talk to one another. If we had to do it face to face, we may not be so mean.
Right, right. There's an easy meanness that happens, and it's really easy to misunderstand one another through technological means. You know, how many of us have sent a message where it was read with very different intent than sent? I did that just last week. Hello. And there was a point, and then the message came back to me like, oh, this isn't going well. And there was a point which I said, we just have to stop. I got to meet this person face to face. The next thing is face to face. Because the ability to read intent accurately through digital means is really very, very hard. Okay, it's easy to get screwed up. But if you're an adolescent particularly, you're growing up thinking that's real. What I'm reading is what they intended. And it's like, no, you gotta give them the benefit of the doubt. You know, would your friend really say that about you? And you know, so it actually takes some help getting over these awkward points and places. I want to go back to that point about trying to present a perfect image. Constantly reading the perfect feeds of others can be detrimental if you don't know them also in real life. Okay? And this I'm understanding happening a lot with college freshmen particularly. So they've gone to high school, they've gone to school with friends, they go off to Boston College and UCLA, and they're keeping in touch with each other on their social media platforms. And they're saying to themselves, sitting here at Boston College, I have no friends. I am so disconnected. And this is a real reality here. I'm feeling so isolated. But my friends are having the time of their life. Because they're reading their feeds, they're looking at their posts, and they're seeing beautiful pictures of fun people having a great time. And it's because it's not challenged by the day-to-day living with these people, they think that what they're seeing is the reality and the wholeness of their life. That contributes to their own sense of isolation. Why am I the only one feeling disconnected? What they don't know until they sit together and actually talk about it, if they do, is that they all felt that way. They all were unsure. They all were lonely, but they thought what they had to put up was these pictures of perfection. The practices of digital communication can be wonderful, but they can also do serious work undermining the relationships they're promising to build and developing deeper divides between the users. Not by anyone's intent or malice, but just by the nature of how the technology works and is used. All right. I'm going to go through the last section, which is short, and then we'll finish up. So it's not a question of all or nothing, as I've been saying. That's too unreasonable and completely unhelpful. The question is, how do we pay attention to when and how technology helps and when it doesn't? And how do we monitor those same questions and concerns with adolescents in our care and company? If they're just learning how to do relationships and developing the skills of relating well, where are the settings in which the relationships are prompting and directing that learning? That's a really important point, okay? We need settings for relating. You know, for all of the reasons named above, digital technology may not be the best aid for learning and developing robust relationships and the skills of relating well. Rather, that technology can contribute to isolation and division, just as I was saying a moment ago. Thus, we need to develop practices for using the technology that limits it to what it does well, and that's very hard, and create time and space free of the technology. Good relationships grow over time, where adolescents can be awkward and then can get over their awkwardness and can be awkward again and get over their awkwardness, where they can make mistakes and be forgiven, where they can risk vulnerability and come to be known and loved for who they really are. The prevalence of digital communication means we must be more intentional about assisting adolescents in the development of relationships and relational skills. So moving from an instrumental engagement with the world to a relational one doesn't come automatically. In fact, some people age without ever gaining the capacity, which begs the question, how well do we practice the skills of relating? And how well do we actively teach those skills? How do we lovingly confront and affirm? How do we call one another to the face-to-face with sufficient frequency so as to overcome awkwardness? How do we manage difficult conversations? Do we communicate the joy of being known, mistakes and all? That's an important thing. Mistakes and all. Do we invite that kind of knowing and vulnerability? Do we teach how to be trustworthy, how to be responsible, how to be respectful, how to care? These are not things that necessarily show up on a resume, but these are the things that are essential to thriving in the world as an adult, and therefore are important for adolescents to learn. Do we practice relating? I want to recommend to you another book. Sherry Turkle's latest book, Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in a Digital Age. She's advising us to return to the face-to-face with intentionality. Our dependence on social-mediated technology has undermined, as she's been saying, our abilities to relate well. But all is not lost, she says. Just start again, get back at it. And you will find how amazing it is to engage, and how willing and eager adolescents are to doing that themselves, if given not only permission, but opportunity. Right? Barbara was reminding me that she starts the book with a study on middle school kids. So she's looking at how is this impacting. So those of you working with kids that young, you'll appreciate what it is she's doing. So in conclusion, I want to summarize some points. Without some further reflection, our practices around the use of technology could be more problematic instead of better. The rise and pervasiveness of digital technologies raises the stakes for our need to be more intentional about communicating and practicing the skills of relating well. For the digital settings, by their nature, largely undermine those skills. So, in summary, technology is masterful at facilitating connections and managing volume. It is not good at deepening relationships and teaching relational skills. So these are just your takeaways for today, right? Adolescents desire relationships, to discover friends, to succeed at work, to find romance, but more basically to seek affirmation and belonging. However, adolescents are just learning how to relate. Just learning what it means to care, be responsible, develop reciprocity, all of it. They're just learning it. It's just being learned at this stage in life, but it will be needed throughout life. So adolescents need settings and opportunities to grow good relationships and learn relational skills. And this is important. They will not think to do this for themselves. because everything around them is telling them not to, particularly the technology industry itself. The technology industry promises that the technology will be the portal through which their lives, relationships will flourish. And they believe that, as most of us do. Right? So we need to be very mindful about creating spaces, face-to-face, real-time, free time, unstructured, overtime, that allow them to create real relationships with real people in real time, in real bodies. So what do we do? First of all, practice timeouts from the device. Number one. Create space for face-to-face relationships that endure over time and that don't have more important agendas. And I think that can be the hardest thing. People say, well, we don't have time to do this because the kids are doing so many other things. And you might ask yourself, why are they doing so many other things? And what really is more important for them to thrive as human persons? Create spaces for silence and inactivity to help adolescents investigate their interior spaces. And most importantly, practice it yourself and invite young people to do it around you. Opting out of digital communication is not possible in the 21st century. It is used in just about every aspect of our lives. However, it has its pitfalls along with its possibilities. In many ways, the technological platforms undermine the incremental process of developing the skills of relating, learning to be vulnerable, learning to be trustworthy, learning to get over awkwardness and self-consciousness, and seeing how we impact the lives of others and they impact us, and developing an integrated sense of identity. These are not all or nothing abilities, nor are they a matter of being perfect. We learn these skills incrementally, first awkwardly, then with time and practice we gain refinement, but never a guarantee of perfection. The back and forth movements of affection, risk, vulnerability, hurt, reconciliation, renewed affection, and increased trust take time and space. They're developed with real people who confront us by their realness and do not let us turn away, but encourage us with love and care to work through the difficulty and to find the joy. This real-time back and forth is exactly what contributes to relationships becoming robust and intimate. To avoid the risks altogether is to avoid the prospect of knowing and being known. So I invite all of us to practice putting down or stepping away from our devices in order to have relationships. Try it. You'll be amazed at what happens. Okay. Thank you. Bye.